Hello, this is Professor Milsom, and this is my introductory lecture for Frankenstein, a short novel by Mary Shelley. It's a terrible selfie I took. I don't look good there, but I'm willing to be undignified to bring you this image. It's me with this famous portrait of Mary Shelley at an exhibition last year at the Morgan. Morgan's a library/museum downtown in Manhattan, and it was the 200th anniversary of the publication of Frankenstein, so they had this huge exhibit, and so some of the photographs in this slideshow come from that. So a little background on Mary Shelley, 1797 to 1851. She wrote novels, plays, travelogues, biographies, and poems. She was, interestingly, the daughter of two of the most famous writers of the 1790s. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft. Think about like Kylie Jenner's daughter, right? That's like the kind of fame maybe you could think of. She was just well known because her parents were these two famous people. It was like if you were the daughter of Kylie Jenner and Bernie Sanders or something. Okay. Moving on. So she then married Percy Shelley, who was one of the most famous romantic poets from that era, when she was a teenager. Scandal. Then she began writing Frankenstein while in Geneva, Switzerland, as part of a ghost story competition that Byron, another famous poet, came up with. We'll talk about this in a minute. And then when Percy Shelley died in 1822, she returned to London, where she wrote, edited his poems, and raised their one surviving child. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, again, another unflattering selfie. You'll notice she died in 1797, and Mary Shelley was born in 1797, and that's because Mary Wollstonecraft died in labor with Mary Shelley, which was very common at the time. So she was extremely famous. She wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792. It's considered one of the first feminist texts. It's like the earliest modern text advocating for, well, the rights of women. She was married to this guy named William Godwin, who is one of the most famous political philosophers of his time. He's kind of like a Bernie Sanders figure, very radical. He didn't believe in marriage. He advocated very left-leaning progressive politics, very controversial. He also was, he wrote novels. He was a brilliant guy. They were both brilliant geniuses. And then, of course, she died while giving birth to Mary Shelley, which was a subject of great guilt and suffering for Mary her entire life. These are pictures from a movie that came out last year starring Elle Fanning. It's called Mary Shelley. It's a biopic. It's basically about her writing Frankenstein, and this is her and Percy Shelley falling in love. So he was one of the most famous English poets of all time. I am not a big fan of his. I find his poems to be very boring, but there's some good ones. We're not going to read any of them. He was obsessed with Mary Shelley's parents. This is why he wanted to be around her. He offered to pay Godwin got into great debt. He had a bookstore, and he offered to pay his debts so that he could live with them. Percy was very rich. At age 16, he had sex with Mary, who was age 14, on her mother's grave. Okay, we're talking super gothic. Back to the graveyard. Is this a true story? One of my professors told it to me. It's somewhat of a legend. And remember, not everything your professor tells you is true, but here she is sitting on a grave, right? So, movie poster, so it must be true. When they got together, some more scandal for you, he was already married to someone else. And when she started having his children, he was already married. So we're talking scandal. Here's Byron, okay, again, from that movie. Byron was one of the most famous English poets of all time. He was one of the first literature celebrities because he was very sexy and scandalous. He was bisexual, but he never had sex with Percy. Even if you watch the Mary Shelley movie, implies that, but that's not true. I mean, maybe it was true, but there's no evidence of that. He had a reputation. One woman who was in love with him described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And he became the most famous writer in England in 1818 with the publication of a poem called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. He went on to have a child with Mary's stepsister. He went into exile in Geneva, or in Europe, because he was so scandalous. He tried to divorce his wife. His daughter his wife was named Ada Lovelace, and incidentally, she was a genius. She invented computer science. True story. Great story, worth reading about. Okay, so I made this little diagram, which you can look at in your spare time. I'm sure you have so much spare time. This is in the slides. It's got, it shows all the relationships. This is just like the drama I find pretty fun. So Percy and Mary here, this is like they're in love. They had many stillbirth children, miscarriages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and only this one lived. So as you're reading Frankenstein, think about this a lot. This is a woman who has, by the time Frankenstein is being published, has had 5 miscarriages or stillborn children who didn't live very long. So it's just like the idea of birth and creating a human is very much on her mind. And also the fact that like she killed her mother. This is how she thinks of it in childbirth. So it's a big theme. Percy also had a child with Mary's stepsister Claire. Then Percy also had 2 kids with his wife Harriet. Mary's mother also had another child who committed suicide right around the time when she was starting to write Frankenstein. Mary's father had this other child, Claire. This is all very extended family. And then Claire had an affair with Byron. They had a daughter named Allegra. She did not live very long. And then I wrote here, George Gordon Lord Byron had affairs with hundreds of men, women, and animals. This is not a lie. This was well known. He was pansexual, and some scholars say he loved men and he loved having sex with women, but he was notorious. That's part of his fame. So these were all friends, lovers, lots of drama. Okay, so let's go to the summer of 1816. That's when she began writing Frankenstein. It was called The Year Without a Summer. It was an interesting event meteorologically. It was cold and dark all summer in Europe because of a volcanic explosion in Indonesia. So think it was like a Gothic summer. Byron one night declared that they will each write a ghost story. They were here in this villa. And Byron, Percy Shelley was there, Mary Shelley, a doctor named Polidori who wrote a very famous vampire story, Claire Claremont, who was Mary's stepsister and Byron's lover. They were all there. And that's when she had like this dream. You can read about it in the introduction. She had a sort of dream which prompted her to write Frankenstein. So it was published in 1818. Its subtitle is Modern Prometheus. Prometheus was a Greek god who broke the laws of the gods by bringing the secret of fire to humans. Here's the cover page of the original. Notice her name is not on it. The first edition from 1818 was much shorter, so we'll talk about this, how it's a framed story. So some of the frame devices were not there in the original. Also, Percy had a big role. He did a lot of revising. These are from photographs I took at the exhibit. This is like the text, and then here's some writing. You notice the editing. This is called revision. This is something we all should be doing with our own writing. And then the version we read is the 1831 edition, so with the changes. So there's a theme about motherhood, as I've mentioned in here, because as I showed you, motherhood was very much on Mary Shelley's mind. 4 children that didn't live past a year. And then she did have this child, Percy Florence, who lived to be quite old. But she believed she killed her own mother, and she herself only had 1 child of 5 that lived. She had constant dreams of bringing dead babies back to life through fire. So again, keep this in mind as you read Frankenstein, this idea of reanimating the dead. That's a word that gets used a lot, reanimation. While Shelley was in mourning for her dead children, Percy had an affair with her stepsister Claire. So he's a jerk. And then while she was writing Frankenstein, she was in fact pregnant. So that's another thing to keep in mind. She's creating a life as she's writing about a scientist who's creating life. Some other things from the exhibit. This is me with pieces of Percy Shelley's skull. They kept those and they put those on display, very gothic. And then here I am with some pieces of Mary Shelley's hair. Again, gross, maybe, very gothic. They, in the 19th century and the 18th century, they liked to keep artifacts like those around. It was a thing. You would put them into jewelry. You know, if you had a lover, you'd give them some of your hair. I encourage you to watch the new film, Mary Shelley. Came out. It begins in 1814. It talks a lot about Mary and Claire, the stepsisters who are best friends. It shows Percy becoming William Godwin's apprentice. Percy starts having an affair with Mary. Mary finds out that Percy is already married with a daughter. Lots of scandal. But there are a lot of historical errors in this movie. So it talks a lot about Mary Shelley being a feminist. She was not a feminist at all. Her mother was, but also keep in mind the term didn't really exist until after Shelley's death anyway. So it's a little counterfactual to impose feminism where it doesn't really exist. It was really not feminism, but her anxiety about motherhood. That was the source of the novel. And then the funny part, one of my friends pointed out that there's all these scenes where like Mary Shelley's writing, and those actually are the words her husband added to the book. So that's pretty dumb. Also, like the costumes are all wrong, the hair is all wrong. It's a lot of errors, but it's a pretty fun movie. I showed it last year, students really liked it. Let's talk a little about Frankenstein. This is really important. I'm going to put this on a quiz, and you can always hear people make this error because people know about Frankenstein. Victor Frankenstein is the name of the doctor, not the creature that he creates. Everyone always talks about this as if this is Frankenstein. No. Frankenstein is a doctor. He's a scientist. So he creates this creature using dead body parts. He gets them from a graveyard, and he zaps them with electricity. The word they use a lot in the book is reanimation. He abandons his creature basically because the creature is ugly. The creature comes to life, and Dr. Frankenstein looks at him and is like, "You're nasty, you're ugly looking," and he runs away. Like the doctor runs away and abandons him. But the creature gets an education and realizes how lonely and sad he is. So the creature runs off to the woods, spies on this family in the woods, learns literature and language. It's very ridiculous. And then he has words for how sad and lonely he is. He gets really mad, finds Frankenstein. Frankenstein refuses to make him a girlfriend. That's all he wants. He just wants a girlfriend so he's not as lonely. So he gets his revenge by killing all of Frankenstein's loved ones. Okay? So that's the plot. And then there's more to it, but basically there's a narrator named Walton who, this is how the story begins. He's like on a scientific adventure, and he's on a ship, and he finds Dr. Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is like basically like very ill and sick because he's in the North Pole trying to find the creature so he can kill him. And then Frankenstein like tells his story to Dr. Walton, who is also a very ambitious scientist. It's like a lesson about not being so ambitious, and eventually, well, you'll see. So that it's what we call a frame tale. So It's a story within a story. But there's like a couple genre words you need to know. This is an epistolary novel. It's a book written in letters. So Walton's writing letters to his sister about this guy he encounters on a ship. And then it's a frame tale. So it's a story within a story within a story. I do a little picture here. Story and a story and a story. So it's like the creature's story told by Frankenstein, told by Walton to his sister, told to us in the book. So I have a little funny thing I saw here on Twitter last year. You can read that. This is like what the frame. It's like it's complicated. This is the most complicated thing about the book. So you've got the De Lacy story. So these are the people the creature spies on in the Alps, and we hear them through the creature. And then this is the creature's story. So he tells us about them, and then we're learning about that through Frankenstein's story to Walton. Here's Walton's story. And then this is all told to us so Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a story about Walton's letters, which tell us Frankenstein's story, which tells us the creature story, which in one point tells us the De Lacy story. Toward the end of the book, Walton actually encounters the creature himself, so we get a little more direct version of his story. You'll see. But come back to this image because it might help you. Here's a character chart, which you can refer to. Over here we have Dr. Frankenstein. He's created the creature. These are the people the creature spies on. Frankenstein's best friend is Henry Clerval. This is Frankenstein's family, his father Alphonse and his mother Caroline. He has an adopted sister Elizabeth, whom he falls in love with, of course. They're planning to get married. Not to give anything away, but it doesn't go well. Then these are other of his brothers. Again, everyone has a really bad ending in this story. Walton, here's Walton. He's writing letters to his sister Margaret, so that's how we learn about this whole thing. And this is a story also about scientific ambition. So Robert Walton is an ambitious scientist. He wants to discover a passage through the North Pole. He's, extraordinarily aggressive in this pursuit. And remember, Dr. Victor Frankenstein was also an ambitious scientist, so he's trying to warn Walton about the dangers of scientific ambition. And around the time that this is being written, this is also the birth of modern science. So that's why this book is considered the first science fiction novel, which is what makes it so important. Anyway, that is your introduction to Frankenstein. I hope this helps you and helps set the stage for the novel for you. There will be a couple other lectures posted over the next few days. Good luck. Use the questions to guide you, and email me if you have any